very small atomic bombs that have a very small area of effect, but they don't blow up very far, but are very concentrated where they do blow up. Essentially like a shaped charge kind of thing, so that you can take out extremely hardened targets, like the kind of bunkers that Saddam Hussein built in Iraq, or also just like really fortified positions. So what we're going to say is the United States, instead of doing that, should offer an amendment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty banning the research and use of micronuclear weapons. Any questions?
Wait, so... Yeah, so instead of researching, we should change our policy entirely.
Yeah, like we haven't spent the money yet. Like the Senate approved the allocation, but it's not like we're wasting money. Like we haven't spent it yet. Instead, we should propose an amendment so that if the rest of the world's amenable to it, and like the vast majority of them are.
To which treaty?
Yeah, to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's a treaty that bans like the spreading of.
All right.
Like how would the amendment process work? Like how many signatories have to sign on to this?
Okay, like I'm not sure exactly what the amendment process is. I'm assuming it's going to be unanimous consent because the United States is the only one who currently is developing this. You can make arguments that maybe China will in 10 years or 30 years after they complete their current development program, but it's unlikely they're going to agree to it now. If you want to argue they won't agree to it, fine, feel free.
All right,
okay. Fantastic. So with that, we've got 3 reasons why this is just like a really fantastic idea to amend this treaty, because developing these things is just a really terrible idea. The first thing we're going to say is that they are largely unnecessary. Understand the United States is the most powerful military in the world. We spend more on our military than the next 14 countries put together. To give you a kind of like an illustrative example of this, we have 15 times as many carriers, like aircraft carriers, as any other country. The only other country that has even one aircraft carrier is Britain. France is building one now. We have overwhelming military superiority. So at that point, given that there are no other countries that could challenge us on the battlefield, no other countries against which we are really going to be fighting a conventional kind of war, obviously like peacekeeping missions and like terrorism are a little bit different, there's no reason to build these kind of weapons because it's unlikely that we're going to be engaging in conflicts in which we really need to do this. But further what I'm saying, well, the weapons we already have may have proven ineffective against Saddam Hussein's bunkers to a certain degree, right? Like we weren't able to penetrate deep within them and kill the people who were within them. They were a little bit effective, right? Like we were able to destroy the facade, destroy the entrances to the bunkers, and take out the Iraqi army, right? Like the war went very well. You can argue that we've lost the peace, but like the war was very effective. So I think at the point at which there's really no reason that we need these particular things. Like the only reason you can justify it for is a very limited sort of like sphere, like killing a dictator essentially. I don't think it's worth spending the kind of money that we would need to spend to develop these particular weapons, particularly given the harms we're going to talk about in a few minutes. No thank you, I'll take you a little bit later. The other problem with this is that when we develop this technology, when we spend the research dollars, we also make it cheaper for other countries to develop it in the future. Understand that the reason that the Soviet Union, and to some degree India and Pakistan, were able to develop nuclear weapons is because American scientists had paved the road. They'd shown what science works and what science doesn't, right? Also, like, there are serious problems with, like, people stealing our secrets. Like, the Chinese, for example, in Los Alamos, stole a lot of our nuclear secrets. They stole our ICBM technology. So, once you develop these particular things, particularly if you're not going to use them, it becomes very likely that other countries will appropriate this technology to use against the United States. And understand, this would be a very effective technology to use against the United States, because when you have an atomic bomb, you can take out an entire division of tanks, right? You're going to take out a huge portion of the American army, right? This kind of asymmetric warfare, we don't need to engage in. We have military superiority. But other countries who are less scrupulous than we are would be able to use these kind of things against us. They're likely to try to attack our vastly more powerful military using these nuclear weapons. That's really bad. Also, I think it creates bad battlefield incentives. Understand that, like, when we're fighting a war and, like, an ammo dump gets seized, right? Like, they steal, like, maybe one of our tanks or, like, steal some of our missiles or something. That's really bad. We try to get it back. But how much worse would it be if they stole, like, a mini nuclear weapon, right? We would definitely have to expend men, money, and resources seizing these things and protecting these things. I don't think that's good for the United States to have to do. I don't think you want to, like, waste money and waste lives, like, guarding these particular weapons. I don't think you would ever deploy them. If you're not going to deploy them, there's no sense in building them. Here. The second thing we're going to talk about is more of an IR kind of point about arms control. And we feel the United States should be engaging in treaties rather than military deterrence, right? Understand there are basically 2 kind of ways that you can deal with taboo weapons. I'm going to illustrate this with conventional nuclear weapons and like biological and chemical weapons, right? The tactic we took toward nuclear weapons was deterrence. Like, if we have more nuclear weapons than anyone else, then they probably won't attack us with their nuclear weapons. This is extremely costly and extremely dangerous because it puts the world in a state of like heightened alert all the time. Like, if we're pointing missiles at Russia, that's really bad. The other approach we took was with chemical and biological weapons, in which we said, if countries, through unanimous consent, can agree not to develop these weapons and not to use these weapons, then we get all the advantage of deterrence, right? Like, we get security that we would get through deterrence, but nobody has to spend the huge amounts of money on these particular things, and nobody has to, like, you know, put people in danger in order to do so. I think we get everyone a little bit more secure when we have this kind of treaty. Sure.
It's like, aren't nuclear weapons a huge component of deterring other countries from using chemicals?
okay, like maybe that's true, but we already have nuclear weapons. I don't think they can really make a cogent argument about why you're going to get more deterrence under their side of the house at the point at which we already have these vastly more powerful nuclear weapons, a vastly more powerful military. Honestly, I don't think any rational regime would get into a military conflict with the United States. The only people who are currently engaging against us militarily are irrational regimes, like terrorists, like Muslim extremists. You can't deter them with any amount of force, so there's no need to get more force. I don't think that's reasonable. But also we feel this sends a very powerful message to the international community. The United States is willing to act through this kind of soft power, willing to act multilaterally rather than unilaterally. This is very important, particularly in the wake of the Iraqi war, when people perceive the United States as a hegemon. They perceive the United States as this like really aggressive power that uses its military in bad ways. I think it's good to say, no, we're willing to engage other countries multilaterally. We're willing to sign treaties and have arms control, even when it limits our options, because we believe in collective security, not just security for ourselves through deterrence, but security for everyone through this kind of like treaty and like long-standing agreement. But the last thing I'm going to talk about here is why developing these things is not just bad for us, but also bad for the world. Firstly, obviously, as I said before, they could be used against us, either if someone develops them or steals them. That's not something that you want. That's a serious threat or reason not to build them. Also, they could be used against other Western powers and our allies. But also, I think this is really important, is the development and use of these weapons removes the stigma against using nuclear weapons in the battlefield, and that's really, really dangerous. Understand that there are a number of countries right now, particularly India and Pakistan, who are engaged in border disputes that have regular, big, full-style nuclear weapons. If the United States sends the message that, while for the last 50 years we've said we won't use nuclear weapons, or at least the subtext has been we don't want to use nuclear weapons, that we are willing to use them on the battlefield, that there are some kinds of conflicts, some kinds of engagements in which it is morally and politically acceptable to use atomic bombs, then we tell other regimes that it is also morally and politically acceptable to use atomic bombs. That's a bad idea. I don't think you can argue that India and Pakistan are going to say, well, the United States can do it, but like we really, really can't. Like that's really bad. No, this causes more escalations, more uncertainty, and more potential threat. I think if you believe anything in this round, you do not want to dissolve the norm against using nuclear weapons. No, thank you, I'm almost out of time. The last thing I'm going to say is, what will other states do when they realize that we have these particular weapons? Because I think for them to win this round, they have to believe that we're going to make other countries like more afraid of us. That dictators are going to know they're not going to be able to like sit inside of their like trenches, sit inside of their bunkers. I think at the point at which dictators feel that they are constantly under threat from the United States, and the point at which dictators feel that like at a moment's notice the United States can take them out personally, they're going to have to try to deter us in any way that they can. How can they do that? They can only do that in the ways that other countries have deterred us, like North Korea, for example, or to a certain degree like Saddam Hussein tried to, by building other taboo weapons, by building chemical and nuclear weapons, so the United States knows that getting into any kind of conflict with these people will have vast civilian casualties, will have vast major problems politically, and that's the only way that they're going to be ready and secure. I don't think you should give that kind of incentives to terrible dictators. For that reason, we propose.
I thank the Prime Minister as calling the Leader of the Opposition to deliver an 8-minute speech to construct the government state.
Alright, thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, members of this panel, members of this most august house. Of course, Michael, you've been a fabulous partner all year long and all tournament long. You guys on side go out for a really interesting case. With that said, I'm going to jump right in. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the nature of current military threats to the United States. Because recognize that as we're fighting the war on terror, we see that the battlefields that we're fighting this war on physically are non-traditional. We're no longer fighting this in the trenches. We're no longer using navies. We're no longer just going head-to-head on a big field like they used to do back in the days of yore. We are actually fighting most of these battles in cave areas, in mountainous regions, places like where we're looking for Osama bin Laden, or places where we looked for Saddam Hussein. We see that in these non-traditional battlefields, the technology that we have, besides tactical nuclear weapons, is sometimes not enough. The government may say there's no need for a certain kind of weapon because we're all just so big and tough already. We got a huge military. Great guys, we have a lot of cruisers. We all have a lot of battleships. Battleships don't go into caves as far as I'm concerned. So we need to develop the capacity to attack people anywhere we need to. Recognizing the current state of the current threat, we see that we need this capacity right now for very specific reasons, which we've seen in the past few years.
Sure. I just want to be totally clear on what you're proposing. So basically what you're saying is, we know that like Osama bin Laden, or suspect Osama bin Laden is in a cave. So rather than sending troops into the cave, we should drop an atomic bomb in the mountain and collapse the entire cave structure. That's basically what you're arguing for.
I'm not going to argue for any specific military strategy in any specific case. I'm saying we need to preserve the option because there will necessarily be a case where this option is the best option in a specific case where that is the best strategy. Recognize, guys, that it's always bad to restrict the ability for you to fight a war because you don't know what current future arrangements of power will be. You don't know what current battlefield arrangements will be. You don't know what like the next battle is going to be. And we see that this is a current strategic problem right now. You have a hole. You can't get people where you need to get them. We say continue to develop this technology. We've seen the need before. We need to continue to develop this through the future. Mike and I strongly believe that the United States government, like every other government in the world, has one priority first, and that is the physical protection of its national security and its own citizens. We say if we have a way to do that, if we have a way to better secure our citizens, but we choose not to, that is a default on this moral obligation. That is necessarily the wrong thing to do in this case. The second thing I'd like to discuss, though, is the idea of technological primacy. Because recognize we've been developing this weapon for a long, long time. We've had versions of tactical nuclear weapons, smaller mini-nukes, since the 1960s. We've been working on this in stages, making it better, making it more efficient, making it more tactical, and more strategically utile. And we've seen that the reason that the United States continues to develop these weapons is because we need to maintain a certain amount of nuclear primacy, just as we look to maintain strategic primacy in every other sphere of life, whether it be military, economic, social, etc. It's in the United States' best interest, strategically, in terms of its international relations capacity and its political capital abroad, that we have the strongest nuclear potential anywhere in the world. I'm not talking about strong just in terms of Big Bang. We also need to be able to deploy things where we need them, specifically particularized to specific situations. We say there are going to be lots of situations where we're going to need this, and if we stop developing it, other countries can continue to develop it. I think that's very problematic for everyone concerned. They say in PMC that there's nobody in their right mind right now who's going to attack the United States. That may or may not be the case. But I think the United States has a duty to future generations to guard against future arrangements of political, geopolitical power. We say in 20 years, in 50 years, in 100 years, it's not necessarily going to be the case that other countries won't be too hot on attacking us. Maybe we will have more powerful enemies then. And if we let ourselves get behind the curve, allowing other countries to go forward by developing tactical nuclear weapons, we lose our primacy. No thank you. But the last thing I'd like to discuss is simply enforcement potential. Because recognize the treaty they're discussing, the Non-Proliferation Treaty of Nuclear Weapons, has no enforcement power or provision whatsoever. So we see that even if we pass this amendment, and then we try to do what they want to do, deter other people from, like allowing other people from, excuse me, if we don't pass this amendment, and none of this works, like we can't, stay ahead of the curve, because other countries can continue to develop this stuff. There's no way for any signatory of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to enforce its provisions on any other signatory. Therefore, we see we will definitely get behind the curve. There's no way we can stop other countries from doing this. We say not only for deterrent reasons, but just for brute military reasons. We have the obligation to have the best military possible, not just the biggest military possible. And we think we have to provide the enforcement where we can. If we can't get legal enforcement, we need to have pragmatic enforcement. We need to tell other countries, we've got this weapon, I think you better stay away from it. No thank you. The first thing to discuss on case is an idea that this is largely unnecessary. Again, he brings up this fallacious argument that we have a huge military that's good enough for anything. All we need are a few battle cruisers and we can handle any military problem. But the problems that we're facing right now are necessarily asymmetric. They're threats that are not necessarily well suited to the kind of military power that the United States is used to having. For instance, the reason that we need bunker busters is that because we're now trying to bust into bunkers in ways that we didn't need to before. I think this is hugely problematic for their side. They think there's no real need for this because we can have weapons that just destroy the facade of the bunker. That's enough. We can just get rid of the face of it, send in troops or whatever. But while that may seem like a generally good idea, there are going to be situations where that's not going to be a good idea, where we don't want to risk our individual troops, and where it really is strategically necessary for us to just take out this bunker. If we can't do it, then we're screwed, because we don't have the ability to symmetrically attack this problem. We say reduce this asymmetricness where you see it. That's necessarily your obligation. They also say under this, though, that you developing this nuclear technology will make it cheaper and easier for other countries to do so. But I think the huge problem with this is that on their case, on their side of the house, they want to allow other countries to do it too. They want to allow this amendment process so that other countries are cool with this, to amend the treaty so that other countries can develop this.
Cool. On that.
Sure.
Yeah, we said that the treaty would ban the use and development of micronuclear weapons. That wasn't just for the United States. The whole point of the treaty applies to everyone. Yeah.
I apologize. Yeah. I misspoke. I was talking about the enforcement provision that I talked about before. Basically, on their side of the house, other countries still have the same means to develop these weapons. They can still use the same technology that we've developed before. They're called nuclear secrets for a reason, because we try to keep them secret. Like, yeah, it's not going to work on 100% of the time. Like, maybe 1% of the time, one of our nuclear secrets is going to seep out. So some other country has like 1% of our nuclear knowledge. We still have a 99% hegemony on like nuclear technology. I think that's best for everyone involved, especially the United States. It may be marginally easier for other countries to get this information if we continue to develop it. That's only because they have to get this information because we're ahead of them. So in the end, they're still screwed, we're still on top, even if we get a tiny leak from this information. But I think this incentive for selling state secrets is still the same on both sides. So thank you. The second thing they discuss is arms control. And they say, mutually assured destruction, we don't like that, because it keeps the world on edge. It's just not nice. Treaties are much nicer, they make people feel more comfortable, because we can all just kind of agree on something, then we don't have to worry about military threats. I think like any reading of any history textbook will tell you that treaties aren't necessarily an effective deterrent. They don't work. This treaty in particular has no enforcement provision. Other treaties, even that do have enforcement provisions, see that countries breach them all the time. There is simply no legal deterrence in the international community, especially when it comes to military technology. We see that we need to provide a practical deterrent, a military deterrent for other countries. The last thing he discusses over this is the idea of removing a nuclear stigma. He says, like, we'll remove the stigma for other countries. Recognize that we can make a clear moral stance because we're not using big nuclear weapons, we're using little ones. I think we can draw a distinction between the two. It's not as if like us doing one moderate thing makes it easier for other countries to be justified in doing extreme things, which we can still legitimately take stance against. Finally, he says dictators will react. They'll be so afraid the United States might have an interest in taking out a dictator through some interesting means that they'll have to fight back, they'll have to deter us. These same incentives exist in the status quo. They're essentially saying every development of our military technology is going to incentivize people to attack us. I think that's silly. We probably do those.
I thank the leader for his remarks and call him a member of government for an 8-minute speech.
Excellent speeches from Todd. Bob gave a terrific Robert Glunt gave a terrific PMC. I'm sure he'll give a terrific PMR. And of course, thank you to the Postal Guest House Postmaster Chair. So I find the opt that we're getting so far to be kind of philosophically safe. And I think it's very, very interesting what they're saying. Although I think problematic because a lot of the conclusions they draw from this aren't really the conclusions that they want to draw from this. Because what they're saying is very clear, right? They say, look, benefits in any kind of military attack, any type of military conflict are always good because you can never be too ready for any kind of military conflict. And the logical extension of this conclusion is that you should always be ready for all situations and spend an infinite amount of money on any type of military investment. Understand that they've never given you any kind of comparative analysis to weigh any kind of military readiness versus all of the harm of international communities react to this, all the problem with asymmetric warfare, other countries getting more advantages over us, all the problem with spending this money in other ways, like not only social programs, but even other types of military programs that could be more effective and more ready. Understand that the US government, like any other government, has a finite amount of resources to spend. So it's not just enough to say that money can be spent in a possibly productive way. You need to weigh that against the harms attached to that money, but also show why that money can't be spent in more productive ways, in more military advantageous ways. And that's what the two things I'm going to talk about this way. So let's get into it. First thing we hear is the nature of the current threat. And they kind of make an interesting argument. They say, look, it's bad to restrict types of war. You should always have all types of military advantages available to you. But again, like I just pointed out, this is incredibly philosophically problematic because this is an argument against any types of arm control, right? But they're not willing to support any types of arms. They're not willing to support all types of arms. They're still against chemical weapons. They're still against biological weapons. These weapons might give the US an advantage. These weapons might be good because it can prepare you for more situations. The reason you should be philosophically opposed to these weapons isn't because it won't give you an advantage. It's because it has tremendous harm to the international community, tremendous harm to the international community, and it doesn't give the United States the same benefit that other countries can derive from this benefit. So while the US might gain a marginal benefit by having mini nukes, by having like nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, the other benefits that are gained to asymmetric actors, like terrorists, like other small states who can't fight conventional wars, is so much greater that the harms of that proliferating into the social consciousness outweighs that tremendously marginal benefit. And that's essentially what it's talking about, like the idea of non-traditional battlefield. I'm similar to you, so. And we have three responses to the idea of the non-traditional battlefield, and how if it is a non-traditional battlefield, the worst thing you can do is give your opponents or inject into the social consciousness your opponents the very weapons they need to destroy you. And we point out the last thing you want to do is to give the asymmetric threat this kind of advantage. We tell you that it encourages other countries to build up these kinds of asymmetric threats at the point which you build up such a tremendous arsenal that no one can possibly compete with you. And it gives more countries the advantage to gain these weapons at the point where there's a possibility of theft, and the point where your technological research is actually injecting this information into the social consciousness, into the international community. It's not enough just to say that secrets are secrets and secrets never get out. At the point where you're actually going to be using these military nukes in situations, it's incredibly probable that this information will get out and will be able to be used. But the second response I have is the idea that what benefit are you really gaining? Conventional weapons are still really, really effective. Like, the war in Iraq still worked pretty effectively. Like, we won the war. The reason we weren't effective wasn't because we couldn't bomb caves, it's because we couldn't find Saddam in those caves. But the third response I want to say is just the idea that in civilian areas, I think it's really, really problematic, especially because it is a non-traditional battlefield, to use like nuclear weapons which have associations of fallout, which cause radiation, which cause all these problems like birth defects and stuff like that, considering the fact that they're right. The non-traditional battlefield means you're going to have to be fighting in civilian areas, be fighting in urban areas. The last thing you want to do is inject all of this bad stuff into these urban areas, a tremendous humanitarian harm on their side of the house.
Like, come on. Obviously, we don't have to defend using nuclear weapons in cities. Like, I don't think birth defects are a risk in caves.
Right, obviously, but if you're right that this is the non-traditional battlefield that you'll have to fight, then at that point, your mini-nukes become completely worthless. Because on this traditional battlefield, you'll need to use these kinds of weapons, and if you refuse to use nuclear weapons in these non-traditional situations, then you'll never get any of the benefits you talk about, because it doesn't give you a tactical advantage. The second thing that they talk about is the idea of primacy. They say, look, we developed nukes for years. In fact, the nuclear weapons program in America is the most important part of our weapons program. This just isn't factually true, right? Like, we haven't built a nuclear weapon, understand, for decades, right? We're destroying the nuclear weapons we have precisely because of the fact that we don't need thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons, because the marginal benefit that they talk about just isn't worth it to the United States. Moreover, they tell you other countries will develop these kinds of weapons. I think it's first off just kind of unfair for them to assert that other countries will break the treaty that we're encouraging the entire international community to sign on to, right? Like, this is kind of the premise of our case. Countries sign on to this treaty, and like most countries that sign on to treaties, like obey them. Like the United States, for instance, signed on to nuclear like SALT talks and stuff like that, and obeys these treaties and does actually limit the amount of nuclear weapons being proliferated. I think the only way they can win this kind of argument is the idea that there won't be an enforcement mechanism. But there is an enforcement mechanism. The IAEA does do inspections, and it's true there's no actual consequence tied to these inspections, but that's true of every single international treaty. The international community, if they found nuclear weapons or the mini-nuke or something like that, would come into these areas and decide whether to levy sanctions, whether to go in militarily, whatever to do. This works in any kind of international scenario. So we're philosophically supposing that all international legislation is completely illegitimate. I don't see why this piece of legislation is any more illegitimate than any other types of legislation. Moreover, I just don't see a good reason for why other countries will develop these kinds of mini-nuclear weapons. And understand that even if it's true that other countries will develop them, it is very, very problematic if other countries already want these nuclear weapons to inject the information into social consciousness. I made this argument a bunch of times. Let's turn case side. So John runs out of time and misses a lot of impacts that Rob talks about. A lot of incredibly important impacts that outweigh a lot of the marginal benefits they talk about being like the biggest country in the world and being like marginally more powerful than other countries. So I'm going to address all of those first, so I don't run out of time. I'm going to start on the second point, the idea of arms control. And we point out this philosophical difference that while deterrence is an effective way of stopping international conflicts, there's a more effective way and a more effective option that we give you, which is mutually exclusive, which is the idea of soft power and enforcing your will through treaties, through international legislation. All of the benefits accrue at the point where you realize that rational regimes are already completely deterred by the United States. That conventional weapons can't deter any other country anymore. At that point, the only people you have to worry about are the asymmetric countries, about the small countries who aren't rational, who just want to destroy you at all costs. We point out that it's incredibly important not to inject these kinds of weapons into the social consciousness, give them this advantage and stuff like that. Moreover, we tell you it's a waste of money, we tell you it's an important PR concern to have this impact on the international community, and we tell you that all of these weapons can be used against you and your allies. At that point, if you really care about the international community, care about your perception abroad, you should use this soft power, especially considering the fact that you don't gain any marginal benefit on their side of the house. Lastly.
Like on treaties, like how effective has that been with North Korea?
Right, like there's some treaties that are effective, there's some treaties that are very I made this argument. Like, shows why there's any more effective the treaty. On the other side, they do necessary, and they don't really gain you any kind of comparative advantage. Again, the only response we hear is that it's good to be ready for any type of situation, and the logical extension of that is spend an infinite amount of money on any case. Understand that I agree we should spend more money on the military on any case. Understand that I agree we should spend more money on the military, or spend money on military in government. I think the revolution of military affairs is a really, really cool thing. Communication is revolutionizing the military, making it possible to such that we can attack things in 2 hours at points where we need 2 days, 2 weeks to attack them. I think that this is a really great thing to invest your money on. But at the point where the military budget has a finite amount of resources, don't invest it the dumb way, invest it the good way. And finally, they just say the idea that, that if other countries develop these kinds of nuclear weapons, the benefits are a wash because you'll still have the mini nukes and it'll just mean they have it too. This is just indicative of a major misunderstanding of their case. They think that the United States gains the same benefits as other asymmetric threats, but that's not true. The United States only gains a marginal benefit over other threats. Other countries gain a tremendous benefit over them. What does this mean? It means that if you actually care about asymmetric warfare, then you want to actually deter people in the cases where you can deter them. The only way to do that is going through our house.
I thank the member for his comments and call upon the member of the opposition to deliver the final constructive speech of the round, not exceeding.
Thank you very much, of course, Mr. Speaker, members of this panel, everyone in this round, good friends on this side of the House, and my partner. It's been a pleasure to debate with all year long. I'm sure it's evident why. That being said, I want to go through, I just sort of want to boil this round down to 2 main points. I think really where the burdens rest on side of the House is they need to show to us that there's really no pressing need for this technology. And I really think that there is one. And I really think we can demonstrate to you an enormous value to having this technology. That being said, if they want to talk about treaties and such, I think they need to prove to us that treaties for disarmament are much more effective than standard methods of deterrence. Because what we're going to support on this side of the House is using deterrence as a method of preventing people from using these weapons is actually the best way to do it. Always has been the best way to do it, and will continue to be the best way to do it in the future. That being said, we get sort of one observation from this side of the House. We get this idea that, of course there are benefits to making sure you can defend against anything, but you need to weigh these against the harms and the costs, the resource costs. Fine, that's fair. First of all, I'd like to point out that we actually have had shoulder-mounted mini nukes since the 1960s, designed to stop tanks moving across Eastern Europe from the Soviet Union. It's true, whatever you want to say.
They're not nuclear weapons. These are armor-penetrating things using depleted uranium. They're not nuclear.
Wrong. They're actually nuclear weapons. That was the whole point. In fact, what was so much fun about it was that you had to dig a hole in the ground so that when you launched it, you were underneath the blast of the nuclear weapon, because you were actually within the fallout range of the weapon. I actually know a lot about this. This technology actually did exist in the 60s using nuclear weapons. What we've done is we've made it much more precise. What they're talking about are much smaller explosions that are much more useful and designed specifically to target underground bunkers. What are they also designed to do? They're actually also designed to create no fallout whatsoever. The way they're buried under the ground, when they penetrate the earth, they're done specifically such that no radiation will ever harm anyone. So just ignore that altogether. It's just factually false. So then they talk about chemical weapons and why is this not different than chemical weapons? First of all, I'd point out that treaties dealing with chemical weapons, not so effective. A lot of countries have a lot of chemical weapons. I don't think this method is effective. How do we stop countries from using chemical weapons? By using standard means of deterrence, such as those that we have with nuclear weapons.
Sure. Okay, on your side of the House, does that mean you'd be willing to philosophically defend no arms control whatsoever because any treaty will never be given to that?
I absolutely believe the deterrence needs to be behind every international treaty regarding arms control. We'll defend that. We think that's the only power enforcement mechanism that comes from these treaties. Look at any treaty that doesn't have this power. Where has it been effective? You see breaches of this all over the place. North Korea, Iran, Iraq, all over the Middle East you have problems with this. There's no reason to suspect that even in the United States doesn't abide by most of these things, that we have chemical weapons. There's no reason to believe a treaty alone. Sure.
Okay, but here's the question. Why do you need more deterrence? More deterrence, right? Aren't countries deterred from building, say, chemical weapons because we have nuclear weapons that we can use against them? Similarly, won't you be deterred from building mini nukes because we have big nukes and a whole lot of tanks and guns and everything else?
What's really beautiful about a weapon like this is that we can say, instead, they frame it the wrong way. They want you to think about when we use this weapon. How about thinking about it when we use this weapon as a threat? When we use it as deterrence? When we say to an individual like Saddam, guess what? We have a target on your bunker right now. We have a nuke aimed at you, and we can get you underground. We want to create the deterrence rather than have them react. That's the purpose of these weapons, and I think the reason why they're having trouble with this is they frame it in the wrong way. They frame it in using the weapon. That's not what we want to do. We want to create the deterrence. So we talk about the nature of threat, and they say, look, it encourages buildups. It encourages buildups and stuff like that. And essentially they're talking about the defense paradox here, that anytime you increase your own defenses, you necessarily increase your threat to other people. It's essentially like a Malthusian model of defense. I actually think this analogy works perfectly. Because Malthus says, like, anytime you increase your ability to create food, you increase population, and then that uses up more food and more people die. So it's like, you get an advance, but everyone catches up right away. But why was Malthus wrong? Because technology improvements happen at such fast rates that you can always stay ahead of the curve. And I think that's exactly what we want to do here. If you're always continuing to progress, then the other half never catches up. It's only when you stop, it's only when you have a hiatus from technological improvement that Malthus's model is correct, and everyone starts dying or living on absolute poverty with the littlest amount to eat. That's why what we suggest is continue to move the curve. Continue to stay ahead. You can't hope to maintain your presence and your power by staying stagnant and saying, we won't develop anything, but we're not going to prevent anyone else to, except with a few words. No, thank you, just a few. So they talk about, look, Iraq was fine, we didn't need it then. But what about in the first Iraq? What if in the first Iraq war we wanted to actually invade Iraq and like go into Baghdad, for instance, and like try and depose him? The only real way we would have deterrence there, we didn't have it in the past, that's why we didn't go all the way into Baghdad, is to say, look, we actually have a nuke pointed on your bunker. This is a new form of deterrence that doesn't exist in the status quo, and a reason why there are uses to this sort of thing. They talk about the humanitarian harm, it doesn't exist at all. Like I said, these are designed to have no humanitarian harms. They also say, because we use it in bunkers, we have to use it in cities. No, we don't. We don't ever have to use it. It has use simply existing. So the next thing we talk about is how we have to continually have the strongest and best arsenal of nuclear weapons. I think this is sort of refers to what I've been telling you earlier about continually pressing the curve, pressing the envelope, and staying ahead. The third thing about enforcement, I think we've covered this pretty well. This is a huge problem for SciGov. Because all they tell us is, look guys, I think countries abide by the treaties they sign. Why? Sure, the countries that don't pose any harm to us, that abide by international norms, yeah, they usually abide by treaties. How about all the countries we're worried about? What's their track record on treaties? Not so great, guys, and I don't think you can rely on simple words to deter them. We never have in the past. We've always used nuclear deterrence in the past to deter them, and I think that this is just a better, more accurate, more precise form of that deterrence that can be used in a whole new array of ways. I gave you a specific example looking to the previous Gulf War, but I think that you need to understand these situations may always arise, no time issue, always arise, and that we need to prepare ourselves for the future, especially given that this isn't a huge resource commitment, that we aren't committed to this in the international community already, that like we're not signed on to this treaty, we're not signed up, we're not in breach of anything right now, so not doing this wouldn't correct any problems. In the status quo, we're fine. So, going case side, we first get this point that it's just unnecessary and that we have power. But recognize the power we're developing here is not redundant in any way. The fact of the matter is, building another carrier, that might be a little wasteful. So instead of building another carrier, let's research a technology to fill a hole in our arsenal, one that we just don't have right now. Like I said, this creates a whole lot more deterrence, but more importantly, like it can be used too. If you ever decide you really need it, that you really need to take out these guys in this bunker, you can only do it on our side of the house. They can't. They can take out the facade of the building. That's nice. Like, what have you done? Not much. There's no effect to that action. Like, the individuals there are still there with their hands on the buttons of like whatever they want to do. We also say you can do your best to try and keep it secret, but the most important way, the best way to prevent people from catching up is to continually advance, to always move forward, because people will always discover what you have, and it's not going to be long until everyone's catched up to where we are right now. The second thing we talk about is arms control. We just tell you, look, treaties aren't great. They always need to be backed up by some sort of deterrence. We'll defend that. We'll say arms control treaties pretty much worthless unless they have some sort of deterrence to back them up. This is an additional deterrence that adds on. And they say the weapons can be used against us, fine. But if we continue to advance and press the envelope, then we'll always be sure we're one step ahead. That's the only way to continue and protect ourselves. The last thing they talk about is it won't make people afraid. They're already under threat. Again, like I told you, sure, it's just a difference of degree, not a difference of type. But it's much more deterrence to say, look, I have a nuke planted on your bunker, and I can kill you right now. For all these reasons, they're trying to propose.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, members of the panel, members of the House, Mike for a great speech, guys on site up for a great round. With that said, I'm just going to crystallize this round onto 3 broad areas of analysis. The first thing I'd like to talk about is effective deterrence. Because a lot of bad people out in the world want to do a lot of bad shit with a lot of bad weapons. And we don't want that to happen. We want us to create ways for us to stop that to happen. And the way that side government has proposed continually is treaties. Let's just use arms control through the form of treaties. Let's get people to sign on to documents, and then of course they'll just abide by those documents. That's just it. Prima facie, people abide by the agreements they've made. Mike and I have explained to you really clearly why there's no reason for people to abide by these agreements, because the incentive structure provides no enforcement mechanism. There's no reason for people not to break these agreements, not to violate these agreements, because nothing happens to them if they do. So Mike and I say this current consequence structure of agreement of abiding by is corrupt. It doesn't work. It's ineffective. It's flimsy. The current consequence structure encourages dictators and other people to violate the agreements that they've made. And any treaty without the enforcement bite will necessarily be an ineffective treaty, a treaty that does not secure our strategic or humanitarian interests. So what Mike and I say is that you have to provide that bite. And that bite only comes in the form of a physical threat. This physical threat is the bunker-busting potential of strategic nuclear weapons. We say manipulate that incentive and consequence structure. Give dictators a reason not to use nuclear or chemical weapons because we can attack them wherever they are. And I think the example Mike brought up about Saddam Hussein is extremely salient and wins us the round right when he said it. If we wanted to go in and depose Saddam Hussein, he would have no reason whatsoever, no international treaty incentive to not use chemical weapons on our troops, Kuwait, Israel, anywhere he wants, unless we have the ability to threaten him personally with one of these strategic weapons. He can just hide in a bunker if we don't develop these and say, sorry guys, I'm safe, I'll let you guys invade and I'll nuke Israel. If we have these strategic weapons, we can threaten Saddam Hussein, say, if you do that, we'll take you out, we'll kill you. We can only provide this deterrent effect if we have the ability to get people where they can hide the easiest. They leave up an extreme hole when they say, we're going to let people hide in caves. We're going to let people hide in these non-traditional battlefields. If we let people hide, we can't deter them. I think we have no effective deterrent when we go outside of the house. The second thing I want to talk about, though, is military hegemony, and I think this is really important. Both sides have agreed that it's generally good for the United States to be on top of the military scene, to be the best military out there. And I think it's extremely critical that we do this by the best means necessary. And what Gov's worried about is, by us developing our military potential, we encourage other countries to develop their military potential to keep up with us. But what they never understand is that it's always in every country's strategic interest to try to catch up with us. The question is whether we let them catch up with us by stopping, standing still, getting rid of our advantage, shunting it off, and waiting for them to catch up. We say no. We say we have to keep ahead of the technological curve. We have to continue to develop upon the advantages that we already have right now. Otherwise, we stop, other countries catch up, we no longer have an advantage, we no longer have hegemony, we're no longer the hegemon, we don't have the power we used to have. We say we need to retain that power in order to be any kind of effective country militarily or politically. But the last thing I want to talk about is simply securing strategic interest. And I want to talk about warfare here in non-traditional battlefields. The same thing I talked about in LSE and the same thing Mike talked about. There are always going to be cases in which we need to use a certain specific weapon to get the interest we want. Sometimes we're just in a bind. We're just in a really shitty, difficult situation, and the thing we want to do is really hard to do unless we have a specific tool available. Arbitrarily removing these tools because we think it'll provide some ancillary benefit elsewhere doesn't help us out because it makes it more difficult for us to secure these strategic interests, to win battles when we need to. And Bonnifield accuses us of saying we never want to limit arms whatsoever. He conflates strategic nuclear weapons with things like chemical weapons. He says we don't like chemical weapons because, of course, they're the same as strategic nuclear weapons. We just want to get rid of them. There's obviously an extreme difference, as Mike pointed out, about the humanitarian consequences of these weapons. Chemical weapons are extremely inhumane weapons. Strategic nukes aren't. We say, for that reason, there's no reason to limit them. We need the best options available for all the opponents.
I thank Lena for his comments and recall the Prime Minister to have a final rebuttal to round the
Here, 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 here. Thank you, everyone, for a really interesting round. Thank you points of crystallization, I'm just going to briefly summarize the author we get to this case, because I think it's actually very amusing if you just kind of like look at it kind of in an overview. We get an LOC that, for the reasons that we need to build this thing is, maybe we might need them in the future, right? I think Adam quite expertly pointed out, this is an argument to build any weapon system. It's an argument to build chemical weapons. It's an argument to build biological weapons. Like, the notion that we might need them in the future can be used to justify any expenditure. At the point at which they can't tell you that it is likely that we'll need them in the future, and the point at which they give you no way of weighing the relative possibility that we might need them in the future versus the amount of money and the amount of harms, I think that we have to win this point. We have to win this round. The other thing they say is that maybe other people will get them. Again, Bonnifield, like awesome MG, responds to this so well. He tells you, look, the notion that other people will get them is not a reason that you need them, right? Like, it's not like one atomic bomb cancels out another atomic bomb. We told you about why we still have deterrence, about why every rational actor is already deterred against the United States, except for their dictator example, and boy, am I getting to that a little bit. Okay? Given the point that every other rational actor is already deterred by our massive military advantage, our massive nuclear advantage, the notion that, okay, so you got big bombs. I don't want to attack you because you got big bombs. When you get small bombs, like, I'm really freaking scared. We think that's nonsense, Mr. Speaker. And quite honestly, unless you buy their like personal deterrence, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, I don't think you can believe that there's any additional deterrent. They can do nothing besides deterrence to keep the United States safe. That's really bad. But in the MO, what do we get? He says, look, we've already got these things. Shoulder-mounted bombs. We've had them since the 70s. Firstly, I don't think that's true, Mr. Speaker. Here. But if it is true, why spend money developing more of them, right? We've already got them, guys. And full-size nukes? Like, how small do they need to be? The other thing they talk about is no fallout. Okay, obviously that's an advantage, but we think it'd be better to have no fallout at all, because, like, again, nuclear weapons really, really bad. And even if we don't believe it, we don't need it. The only real interesting point that he gives is that we need constantly more powerful and more technology to like keep ahead of the curve, right? Like otherwise people are going to catch up. But what we tell you, what he expertly tells you in MG is that this actually gives other countries a way to catch up with us very, very quickly, right? We get a small advantage from developing micronuclear weapons. We can take out bunkers. But they get a huge advantage, right? A country that doesn't have battalions of soldiers, a country that doesn't have tons and tons of tanks and tons of like military force, now gets the ability to counter our tanks, our military force, and our bombs. Given that this actually gives other people another way to attack us, we think that it's actually better for us not to develop it at all.
Here, here.
They also talk about personal deterrence. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about because it's really close to our side of the house. But just to give you a little like reminder, like remember my last point on case. So the first thing the first like crystallization point I want to say is there a need? Like, do we need to do it? And is it worth it, right? The only real reason they give you to develop these weapons is we might have bunkers and we might have caves, and like we can't neutralize them any other way. As I told you in my PMC, I don't think that bunkers and caves are a huge threat. There are other ways that you can neutralize them. You can bomb like the facades. There's no way in or out of the bunker. If Saddam Hussein wants to live the next 20 years of his life in a rat hole, like fine. That's like I don't think we need to spend millions of dollars to ensure that we personally kill the dictator. I think that's nonsense. We can send troops into caves, or gosh darn it, we can use the real nuclear weapons, so there's really nobody around, and you can like legitimately leave this place. But also we say that, like, look, it's not enough to say that there might be a circumstance in which we got it. Like, if we were to be given these things for free, maybe you can argue, okay, well, there's no reason to turn it down. But if we have to spend millions of dollars and send a really bad message to the international community, they fail to recognize that there is a cost associated with developing these weapons, right? And if you can't believe that there's a cost, or they haven't shown you why their cost outweighs our benefit, I don't think they can carry this around. They haven't given you a voting issue. The second thing, though, I want to talk about is international implications. Boy, does this not get addressed properly in this round. We tell you that other countries can get it cheaper, and we tell you why they have a huge incentive to develop it because it's very effective against the United States. All they say is, well, maybe some technology will leak out, but like not all of it will. Mr. Speaker, they can come to our universities and learn how to build these bombs, right? They can break into Los Alamos in the way the Chinese broke into Los Alamos and got the plans to all of our ICBMs. I don't think that you can believe that nobody will ever get this, but also, maybe they don't get it in 5 years, but they very well could get it in 10 years or 20 years. You will at least have proven that it can be done, and that's huge in terms of developing this stuff. Like, if you try to do this and fail, people won't do it, but if you try to do this and succeed, people will know that it is possible to build a mighty nuclear weapon, so they will spend the research dollars. But also, we say that this removes the stigma against using atomic bombs. Holy crap, Mr. Speaker. Like, understand there are a whole lot of nuclear powers, some of them small nuclear powers in the world, and we tell them that it is not acceptable, firstly, for them to have atomic bombs, but it sure as heck isn't acceptable for them to use atomic bombs, right? They don't respond to this. If India and Pakistan were to go to war, they could very well use atomic weapons, and if we send the message to them that there are no consequences associated with breaking the nuclear taboo, that the United States is willing to do it and allow other countries to do it, then they will probably go nuclear. That's a huge threat to world security, that's a huge threat to American interest, and they don't tell you why it's not true. Honestly, Mr. Speaker, if you believe nothing else, don't give India and Pakistan like the legitimation to use nuclear weapons, often on civilians, in their war. That's bad. But the last thing I want to talk about is what will dictators think? They say we can kill them at a moment's notice. All right, so if I'm a dictator and I can be killed at a moment's notice, what is my rational choice, right? They say, I'm going to become a Democrat. Like, I'm going to become a really, really nice guy and do whatever the Americans say. What we say is, if a dictator knows the Americans can kill him at a moment's notice, he's not going to become a Democrat. He's going to look for a way to deter American action. How is he going to do that? Through building these taboo weapons. Biological weapons. The United States knows that if it attacks his country and kills him personally, there are huge consequences to the United States. That its allies are going to be attacked with chemical or biological weapons. That there could be nuclear retaliation. That it's going to be the biggest shit list in the world. You do not want to give dictators the incentives to build these weapons. All of the deterrence arguments they make about the United States also apply to dictators, right? If you believe it's really bad that other countries might get it, it'd be really freaking bad if they did. So for all these reasons,